Hello, everyone. I'm Dana Ricci, the Director of Alumni Relations and Engagement for the School of Arts and Sciences. I would like to welcome you to our virtual Scarlet Speaker Series. If this is your first one, welcome. And if you are a repeat attendee, welcome back. As a reminder, everyone's microphones are muted. That way there's no background noise during the presentation. We would like to ask you to use the Q&A feature to submit any questions, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. If we need any clarification, we'll be able to unmute you. Also, this event will be recorded and we will share it afterwards. So if you want to send it to anyone who may not have been able to join us live, that will be available. Please know that these events are not just for Rutgers alums. So if you ever see an invitation and it's a topic that you think someone you know might appreciate, please forward them the invitation. Now I would like to introduce Alec Walen. Alec is a professor at Rutgers University who currently serves as the director of the program in criminal justice at Rutgers, New Brunswick. He holds a cross appointment in the School of Law and the Philosophy Department. He recently published a book on moral rights and just war theory, the mechanics of claims and permissible killing in war. He is a co-director of the Rutgers Institute for Law and Philosophy and an associate editor at the journal Law and Philosophy. He is currently working on papers in various topics in the theory of criminal law, including blame, causation, and rights forfeiture. Now I would like to introduce Alec.
So, can everyone hear me? This is nice to be here. Thank you very much for Dana for inviting me to give this talk. I am honored to be a Scarlet speaker. My question, as the title slide indicates, is, can an unjust society justly punish criminals? This is a philosophical question requiring us to explore the notions of justice in a society, the prerequisites of just punishment, and what it means for someone to be a criminal. Oops, excuse me. There we go. The source of my question is the growing awareness in society of its injustices. Police killings, especially of Black people who presented no grave and imminent threat to anyone, neither the officers who killed them nor anyone else, have given rise to the Black Lives Matter movement. Our society's extreme embrace of mass incarceration and the toll it takes on the communities from which most of the incarcerated come, poor and minority communities, is also something more and more people are aware of. The growing wealth gap and general economic injustice is another problem more and more people seem to be aware of. And people also seem to be becoming more aware of the structural racism in our society, a kind of structural indifference to the way that the explicitly racist policies of the past are perpetrated in the present, and how the ongoing effects of those policies compound the problems that minorities face. Given the growing awareness of these sorts of injustices, it's no surprise if people should wonder about defunding the police and abolishing or seriously reducing the reach of the criminal justice system. I'm going to focus this talk on the second. Note that this idea of abolitionism may not be politically mainstream, but it is academically mainstream enough that last year there was a special issue of the Harvard Law Review devoted to it. I'm not going to engage with the question whether the criminal justice system as a whole should be abolished. I'm going to take up a narrower question or set of questions: whether an unjust society can justly punish criminals, especially those who are victims of its injustice, especially those who seemingly became criminals because of that injustice. So I'm not concerned with the general abolition of state punishment, but with the argument that we have to at least modify and limit the state's punitive practices because of the injustice in our society. So here's an outline for the rest of the talk. To answer my question, I'll proceed as follows. First, I'll argue that we are in some important ways an unjust society, especially with regard to economic injustice and racial injustice. Second, I'll present reasons for thinking that such injustices are inconsistent with the state blaming at least those criminals who are victims of the injustice. And third, I'll argue that these reasons do not present a general obstacle to punishing criminals who are victims of injustice, though these reasons should block punishment in some cases. So just how is our society unjust? Note, I don't want to suggest that it is pervasively unjust, so unjust that violent revolution is called for. My claim is only that it is in some important ways unjust, and there are two ways in particular that I'll focus on: economic and racial injustice. I don't mean thereby to dismiss injustices based on sex, sexuality, sexual identification, disability status, religion, or what have you. But I want to focus on these two, economic and racial injustice, because they seem most clearly connected to criminal activity. That is, they are criminogenic. I'm going to use that word a lot, and it may not be familiar, so let me pause to define it. A condition is criminogenic if it tends to cause people to engage in criminal acts. On economic injustice, then, consider this slide from the Pew Center. I hope you can see my cursor. It's going to help to highlight what's relevant in the slide. Notice how the distribution of wealth changed from 1983, I can't see my cursor, there it is, from 1983 to 2016. In 1983, the upper income families held 60% of the wealth. By 2016, that grew to nearly 80%. In 1983, the middle income families held about a third of the wealth. By 2016, that fell to less than 20%. And the lower income families' share of aggregate wealth fell by almost a half, from 7% to 4%. Now, growth of wealth inequality by itself is not a sure sign of injustice, but I follow John Rawls's basic idea from a theory of justice that the basic rules of a society ought to be laid out so that the end result is that the worst off are as well off as possible. The change in the distribution of wealth in the last slide suggests that the worst off are not now doing as well as possible, they were doing better before, and thus that the system is unjust. It also matters whether economic differences are more or less set by birth. If they mostly reflect something like desire to earn more and the effort people put into satisfying that desire, then economic differences would seem to be a matter of individual choice and not a sign of economic injustice. But at least in the US, again, the trends are going in the wrong direction. Overall, this slide shows that the percent of children earning more than their parents is going down over the decades. Compare the 1940 line, where very high percentage of people, all the way until you get to the very people born to the very wealthiest classes, are earning more than their parents 30 some years later, and they themselves are in their 30s. That goes down from 1940 to 50 and continues to fall down to 1980. These are the people who would be measured as adults in around 2010. Okay, so that's going down, but let's focus on the chance that people born into the 20th percentile will earn more than their parents. Children born in 1950, I think 1940, you've got the strange effects of World War II. Let's start in 1950. Those children would have had a nearly 90% chance, you can see it right here, 90% chance of earning more than their parents by the time they reached the same age. This may largely reflect the robust economic growth at that period of our country's history, but it was also economic growth that was working its way all the way down through the economy. Children born in 1980, however, would have only slightly better than a 50-50 chance of doing better than their parents by the time they reached the same age. In a society where birth didn't matter much, and where welfare didn't change much over time, where each generation did about as well as the one before, those born in the lowest 20th percentile would have about an 80% chance of doing better than their parents. The fact that it fell to nearly 50% implies that being born poor is becoming, over these decades, hard to overcome. My conclusion from these two slides is that a lot of the inequality is both unnecessary and not based on choice. Thus, it shows our society's economic injustice. Finally, this economic injustice, insofar as it leads to poverty, is also, as this article by Karina Grafe et al. Points out, criminogenic. Notice how it predicts not just being arrested or incarcerated, but also criminal acts in themselves: adolescent violent crime, aggression, domestic violence, and recidivism. In other words, there's good reason to believe that our economic system our unjust economic system, helps to explain why those who get the short end of the stick commit the crimes they commit. Turning to racial injustice, I'm going to present 3 quotes from Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, The Case for Reparations. First, on concentrated Black poverty, he notes that, and I'm quoting from the slide here, Patrick Sharkey, a sociologist at New York University, studied children born from 1955 through 1970 and found that 4% of whites and 62% of Blacks across America had been raised in poor neighborhoods. A generation later, the same study showed virtually nothing had changed. Second, on structural racism, he notes that, quote, Black college graduates still suffer higher unemployment rates than white college graduates, and Black job applicants without criminal records enjoy roughly the same chance of getting hired as white applicants with criminal records. These facts about Black unemployment could be the result of a lot of individual racism on the part of employers, but it seems likely that they also reflect and contribute to structural racism. It also is important to point out that this pair of comparative statistics provides just one glimpse into the effects of racism, both individual and structural, in our society. But they suffice to illustrate the point, and then we can turn to the connection between racism and crime, which is illustrated in this text. Quote, when Robert J. Sampson examined incarceration rates in Chicago in his 2012 book, Great American City, he found that a Black neighborhood with one of the highest incarceration rates, West Garfield Park, had a rate more than 40 times as high as the white neighborhood with the highest rate, clearing, 40 times. A discrepancy that great is not merely a reflection of racist policing. It's also a reflection of higher crime rates in at least some parts of the Black community. In sum, there can be little doubt that racism in America is not only unjust and not only connected with economic injustice, but is also a contributing cause of criminal behavior. With that, I take myself to have said enough about the premise that we are an unjust society and that the injustice in our society helps to explain criminal activity in our society. I turn now to the second part of the argument, namely, that these injustices have potential implications for the criminal law. I will focus on 2 main theories as to why they have a potential implication for the criminal law. First, criminals are less blameworthy insofar as they are the victims of the sorts of societal injustices just covered. Second, society, in particular its law, its sentencing judges, has lost its standing to blame those who suffer the sorts of societal injustices just covered. I will start by examining 3 possible reasons to accept each of these theories. Starting with the idea that society's injustice makes criminals less blameworthy. The first reason to accept that is tit-for-tat thinking. If one has been treated unjustly, one will tend to lash out and treat others unjustly. This may even be justified if one is responding to the original unjust actor. But even when tit for tat is not justified, it's an all too human response with which we should be sympathetic and therefore ready to excuse. Compare Churchill deciding to bomb Berlin after the Nazis bombed London. A wrong for a wrong is still wrong, but it's hard to blame people when their wrongdoing is an all too human response. Second, if the environment is criminogenic, then it's less reasonable to expect lawful behavior. Insofar as it is unreasonable to expect it, failure to deliver it should be at least partly excused. Third, these 2 ideas can be combined. If criminogenic circumstances give rise to a natural reaction to the state and its law, and if the state wrongs the victims of those circumstances by fostering or allowing those circumstances to exist, then the criminal acts would seem to be doubly excused. Okay, turning to the second theory, that society has lost its standing, and in particular that its criminal law courts have lost their standing, to blame those who suffer from its injustices. Let's start by being clear about the notion of standing. In the law, standing to bring a case is a prerequisite to having a right to bring it. If A has been injured by B, then A has standing to sue B. By contrast, if C just saw A get injured by B and C was not especially traumatized, then C lacks standing to sue B. That's because the court system doesn't want busybodies bringing suits. They want suits to be brought only by those with a clear personal stake. I'm using the moral equivalent. To have standing to blame is to have the right to express blame. Morality is different from the law. In the moral context, we don't object to busybodies. There's nothing morally wrong with the thought that C can blame B for A's injury. Standing problems arise in morality when you forfeit your right to express or lay blame because of some fault of your own. So the first reason to accept the idea that an unjust society has lost the standing to blame can be expressed with the question, who are you to blame if you too are unjust? Compare a thief complaining if his property is stolen. A second reason can be expressed with the question, who are you to blame if you treat me unjustly? Imagine a thief steals from A, then A steals from B, and the thief says to A, shame on you for stealing. The third reason can be expressed with the question, who are you to blame if you bear responsibility for my acting unjustly? Imagine A coerced B into stealing, and then A blames B for doing so. But one might object at this point that I'm mistakenly treating the criminal law as necessarily involving blame. If it can be cut loose from blame, then the problems just mentioned, which all focus on blame, can perhaps be got around. So why treat criminal law as presupposing blame? Why not treat it simply as a tool for doling out harsh treatment that aims to deter crime and to incapacitate or reform the dangerous? There's a two-part reason to link the criminal law and blame. Reason one concerns criminal law doctrine. Excuses like duress, provocation, and insanity are all based on the thought that if a person deserves less blame or no blame, then the punishment should be lighter or withheld altogether. The voluntary act requirement in criminal law implies that if a person acted involuntarily, she can't be punished. This is like an excuse, except the burden is on the state to prove a voluntary act. And different levels of culpability, as tracked by different kinds of mens rea, purpose versus recklessness versus negligence, and the limitations on strict liability crimes show how much we care about blameworthiness. All these features of standard criminal law doctrine show a deep connection between the criminal law and blame. The second reason to link criminal law and blame appeals to deep moral principles underlying the justifiability of the criminal law, and its punitive practices. The idea is that a pure utilitarian justification of punitive practices, one appealing simply to the idea of doing what will promote the greater good, is actually morally monstrous. We can see that by looking at the traditional utilitarian goals of punishment, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. If we dispense with the idea that criminals forfeit their right not to be punished by engaging in culpable wrongdoing, and appeal directly to these goods, we should be repulsed. Excuse me, I have a dog barking in the background. As a justification for deterrence, simple pursuit of the greater good would allow us to frame the innocent if it would deter. This is morally unacceptable and on a par with using people like slaves or unconsenting guinea pigs. As a justification for incapacitation, the unqualified pursuit of the greater good does away with the presumption of innocence and responsibility for self that is crucial to respecting people as responsible adults. If people are responsible adults, we should generally treat them as if they will act lawfully. As a justification for rehabilitation, the problem is the same as for incapacitation. They should be presumed innocent and not in need of rehabilitation unless they have forfeited that presumption by having committed a culpable criminal act. But if a utilitarian justification for rehabilitation can also, utilitarian justification for rehabilitation can also involve a a dimension of offensive paternalism. If people are responsible adults, it's up to them to reform themselves. We shouldn't impose it on them for their own good. Now, for those who want to get into the weeds, you might argue that there is a middle position. People can forfeit their right not to be punished by committing crimes, even if they cannot be blamed for those crimes. I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A, but for now I'll proceed with the assumption that the criminal law should presuppose that criminals can be subject to punishment only if they do something culpable, that is wrong, for which they can be blamed. So now we come to a dilemma. Philosophers love dilemmas. It's how we know we've hit on a good problem. The dilemma is either we must accept the utilitarian justification for something that looks a lot like the criminal law, minus blame. This requires responding to the objections I just raised. Or we as a society must leave people free to do what they want. That is, to act with impunity if the state is too unjust, especially if it's unjust to them. This may require the state to allow even more injustice to the victims of crime, many of whom already suffer injustices at the hands of the state. This seems to be a nasty dilemma. I don't want to get gored on either horn. I think both are unacceptable. So we need to think about where else in the argument we might look to try to escape it. My solution is to deny some of the implications of injustice for blame that I advanced above. I don't want to deny them completely, but I do want to deny most of the force of the standing argument, and I want to make some important distinctions that affect when injustice suffered should excuse unjust actions. Let's start with the standing argument. I'll quote here from a young scholar named Ben Ewing. So even in a fair and just state with admirable laws and policies, there would still be victims of serious and plausibly criminogenic interpersonal wrongdoing. It appears odd, however, to suppose that the victims of seemingly unfair criminogenic disadvantages should lose the bulk of their claim to special treatment in the criminal law if their disadvantages have arisen from abuse perpetrated by family members, friends, or fellow citizens, rather than from injustice perpetrated by their state or society. So consider this example. Suppose two people were horribly abused as children and have developed, as a result, a terrible sense of self-worth and a terrible temper. To calm their own self-critical thoughts, they both have taken to abusing alcohol, and both then lose control of their tempers and become violent, abusive drunks. They both marry, and a year or so into their marriage, beat their wives horribly. Both wives choose not to call the police the first time, but threaten divorce. Both husbands express remorse and pledge to be better, but both backslide and beat their wives again, upon which they are each arrested and charged with aggravated assault. One comes from a wealthy family, where he was terribly abused as a boy. One comes from a poor family, one whose poverty was more extreme than would have existed in a just society, and he too was terribly abused as a boy. Do we really want to say that the state may punish the one who was born into a rich family, but who was nonetheless terribly abused as a boy, but not the one who was born into a poor family? Ewing's point is that we should think that the more important question is whether exposure to horrible abuse as a child excuses, in part or in whole, their violent behavior. The state's standing to blame seems secondary. The second problem with the standing argument is that the state is the only entity that could have standing to punish in a way that speaks for all of its citizens, that would support the idea of a serious punishment for the kinds of crimes the state should try to prevent. The state may not, as a matter of fact, do a good job of speaking for all of its citizens, but for it to have any legitimacy as a state, it has to aspire to do so, and nothing else. No private organizations, corporations, churches, civic groups, or individuals could hope to speak for the state, at least not without becoming the state. The right way to think about standing is not to insist that the state refrain from punishing and blaming the culpable. Rather, It should make it clear that it does so, not pretending to perfect justice itself. Indeed, as it condemns people for their culpable wrongdoing, it should also publicly own its own shortcomings and commit itself to doing better, a theme to which I'll return at the end. But it should also make clear that it condemns not as just some other person, whether natural or artificial, but as the representative of the community that values justice from both the state and its residents. So let's turn to the other theory about why the injustice of the state might undermine the blameworthiness of criminals who suffer from that injustice. To examine that theory, we need to distinguish mala in se crimes, crimes that are bad in themselves, from mala prohibita, crimes that are bad because the acts or omissions in question are prohibited. As the slide says, the former can be illustrated with murder, rape, assault, and theft. The latter with things like not paying taxes and driving without a license. My thesis is that suffering injustice does little to undermine blameworthiness for mala in se crimes. It may be more relevant to mala prohibita crimes, but only because it justifies them, not because it excuses them. In the context of mala in se crimes like murder, rape, theft, and the kind of spousal abuse, aggravated assault, that we considered a few slides back, we should expect people to avoid committing these sorts of crimes no matter what injustices they have suffered. Even if the injustices are criminogenic, the effect is normally consistent with responsibility for choices. That is, it's not like having a gun to your head or being drugged and rendered temporarily insane. We are all shaped by nature and nurture, yet to respect us as responsible agents, the state must treat us as owning our values in the way we put them into practice. Now, some may be so severely impacted by criminogenic influences, perhaps the abusive husbands I mentioned a few slides back, that it's better to excuse their crimes. But this is a position to take only in extreme cases, because the implication is so disrespectful to them. To them it says, you are not to be treated like a responsible person, but like a dangerous animal. If others need the protection, that is, if it would be a worse injustice to let these so-called dangerous animals go free, then they will need to be incapacitated, as we do with the dangerous and insane. One might be tempted to object that I make the issue too black and white. The abusive husbands deserve, one might think, a partial excuse to reflect their criminogenic upbringing. But I reject that suggestion. There are partial excuses, like provocation, which reduces murder to manslaughter. But such mitigation reflects the idea that we can't reasonably expect people to have steeled themselves in advance of being severely provoked, to resisting the urge to respond with violence to a limited range of provocative acts. But we should expect all people to learn, by the time they are adults, not to fly into violent rages unprovoked. If we let those with criminogenic backgrounds enjoy a general mitigation of their punishment, then we will do less to deter or incapacitate them than we do for others. This would expose their potential victims to a greater risk of being victimized. In my view, this is generally unjustifiable. It's better to say that the price of being treated as a free, responsible person is that one has to rise to the challenge of behaving well. Even if that is more challenging to some than to others, those who find it more challenging either need to rise to the challenge or be subjected to extra restrictions that reflect the judgment that they cannot do so. That is, if they cannot be expected to govern themselves as all others do, then they have to be treated as dangerous animals. Again, respect calls for trying to treat them as responsible people unless they are severely impacted by criminogenic influences, so severely that it would be cruel to hold them responsible for what they do. Now let's turn to mala prohibita and ask if the regulations and their enforcement of the criminal law are still justified, despite the injustice in society. In asking this, we must keep in mind that even a state as unjust as ours also has a lot of good and just regulations. So we need to proceed with a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Now I see we're coming to the end of my 30 minutes of talking, so I'm going to skip the tax code example and just talk about the driver's license example. In general, it's a good idea to have a requirement that people be licensed to drive potential killing machines. But the state often suspends the licenses to the poor as a punishment and then locks them into a vicious cycle in which they cannot lawfully drive. But if they don't drive, given the state of public transportation, they cannot support themselves. And so they are pressured into breaking the law and driving without a license. Again, in certain conditions, driving without a license is justified. On the other hand, if one has lost one's license for driving unsafely, then further driving without one should be a serious crime. The devil's in the details, and I want to reject the approach to the law that says that it simply has to be respected and enforced no matter how unjust it is. Now, one might object that taking justice into account in enforcing the law is unrealistic. One might take the standard line that if the courts don't strike down a law as unconstitutional, whether through and through, on its face, as constitutional law cases put it, or as applied to a particular case, then the other players in the criminal justice system just have to go along. Otherwise, we risk anarchy. But I think that's a panicky overreaction to what I'm saying. Prosecutors take themselves through the notion of prosecutorial ethics to be charged with doing justice. As the National District Attorneys Association puts it, their primary responsibility is, quote, to seek justice, end quote. They should therefore not seek to enforce particular laws that are unjust, whether on their face or as applied. And jurors too should exercise the power they have to nullify the law, to refuse to convict when conviction would be unjust. So, here's a review. I have argued we are in some important ways an unjust society, especially with regard to economic injustice and racial injustice. There are reasons to think that such injustices are inconsistent with the state blaming at least those criminals who are victims of the injustice. These reasons concern the blameworthiness of criminal actions and the state's standing to blame. But I've argued that these reasons do not present a general obstacle to punishing criminals who are victims of injustice. So in conclusion, I want to say yes, an unjust society can justly punish criminals, but society should also recognize its duties. First, to strive to rectify the underlying injustices, to recognize that some acts that would be wrongful crimes in a just society are justified in the face of certain injustices. For example, driving without a license when the suspension puts the person in an economic bind and is not grounded in a history of unsafe driving. Third and last, to help those who have been driven to criminal activities in part by those injustices by offering them mental health, training, other resources. In other words, by offering them rehabilitation so that if and when they have done their time, they are less tempted by criminal wrongdoing in the future. Okay, I think I went maybe a minute or two over, but that's the end of what I have to do. I'm going to stop sharing, and I guess Dana will come back on with questions.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so we got a few pre-submitted questions, and then I'll start taking some from the Q&A. The first one I have is, do you think things will ever change in this society? Why is it that people still aren't having fair trials in the year 2020?
Okay, so I do think things will continue to change. They have changed. The Warren Court era was an era in which the court itself tried to do a lot to change the way trials were done. Think, for example, of the right to counsel. It was possible for people to be tried without having access to counsel. That has been rectified. The right to have a jury of your peers that is not racially composed so that, let's say, if you're a black defendant, all the black jurors are gone. That also has been addressed. There are a number of problems in the system that have been addressed. What can we do in the long run? I mean, in the long run, it's the long run, it's the long fight. Injustice, I think it was Martin Luther King who said, the arc of the universe bends towards justice, I don't remember the full quote. The point of the quote, however, is that it's a long arc. So I'm an optimist, but it won't be easy and it won't be soon, but it'll be gradual.
Okay, the next pre-submitted question. How do you think defunding the police is going to improve the lives of African Americans in this country?
So that question presupposes that I do believe this. So let's start by defining defund the police. That's one of these slogans that's probably really unfortunate because I don't think many of the people who initially embraced the idea believe that the police should simply be completely defunded, zeroed out. You know, there is no clear alternative to the police ready to go and step in. And if a power vacuum is created, we already have lots of evidence as to what will happen. Criminal gangs will come in and fill the vacuum. So I don't think that defunding the police in general is a good idea, or rather defunding the police completely is a good idea. But there's another idea of defunding the police, which is partial reallocation of the funds that have traditionally gone to the police, that have been going more and more to the police, into other agencies. So for example, do you need to send police officers in to all domestic dispute cases? That's true. That is what is normally done. There's a domestic dispute call, police come. Well, police are ready to arrest, and if there's violence, to escalate so that they can use more force than they're confronted with. That may not be the best way to handle these situations. It may be that we should have people who are skilled in mediation and negotiation, who are brought in a wide range of cases to try to diffuse a situation rather than sending police officers whose training in diffusing is rather limited. So there are reasons to think that some reallocation of funding from police to other agencies could be helpful. I think this is the sort of thing which has to be worked out empirically. What is actually going to work better and what's going to create more problems? One of the things I should also refer to, I guess, is I think the police chief in Camden, New Jersey was called Thompson. I don't remember his first name. This is a case where what happened was actually fundamentally breaking the police union. The police union had been blocking reforms, as happens in many places. And in general, I'm in favor of unions, but the police union, I think, has done, in many locations, I can't say all, but in many locations, it's been an obstacle to meaningful reform. Just as a little side note, in Minneapolis, after the death of George Floyd, the police union came out and said, basically, we will say nothing critical about the officers involved in the Floyd killing. Well, that's a problem. Right? There was something wrong in the killing, the murder of George Floyd. Once he was subdued, he didn't need to be killed. Okay, so back to Police Chief Thompson. They basically shut down the Camden police force and created a new countywide force, and the officers in Camden had to reapply for their jobs, and the ones who didn't want change didn't reapply. And the murder rate has gone way down in Camden. The police are now in much better connection with the community. It's not a panacea. The point is there are reforms that can work if given the chance to work. And there are some well-known obstacles, including the police unions, to bringing those reforms about. Long-winded. I hope it wasn't too long-winded.
Okay, next question.
Yes.
When the U.S. President and his personal attorney, the U.S. Attorney General, do not acknowledge structural racism, how can we as a nation expect fair justice?
Yeah, well, it's tough. I don't want to get drawn into a discussion of our current president. I think there are many problems there, but I don't want to get derailed in that way. Let's just say that even if the president is not acknowledging structural racism in our society, there are many other actors in society who can acknowledge them, from governors to mayors to senators, representatives, to other forms of public leaders. Here's a comparison. Trump pulled the United States out of the Paris Accord, one of his first acts, which only came to fruition very recently. But I believe there's something like 20 some states that have committed themselves to following through on the Paris Accords on global climate change. So if the federal government can't lead, it doesn't mean no one can lead. And we can hope that the federal government will come along and resume leadership at some point in the not too distant future.
Okay, this one's a little long, so
Okay, I got my pen ready to take notes.
is it fair to interpret your presentation as being a middle ground analysis between structure and agency? Are you in the abstract saying that two things can be true at the same time? That regardless of whether we exist in a dystopia or a utopia, and so long as humans are understood as having agency, free will, and are not being used as a means to an end, that certain kinds of wrongdoing are worthy of punishment, no matter how morally impermissible the systems of punishment might be. And then they give an analogy of if I'm stopped for driving 70 in a 50, and I was in fact keeping up with the pace of traffic, the fact that I might be racially or ethically stereotyped is separate from the fact that I'm responsible for speeding, assuming that I knew what the speed limit was and that I made an intentional choice to do so. Would this analogy apply to your presentation?
There is a lot there. And I wish I had that written in front of me so that I could see it. Is it possible, Dana, to get the chat to show that?
Yes. So I just moved it into the answered column. So if you click at the bottom of your screen Q&A, you see that?
Oh,
And
I see.
then you'll have three tabs: open, answered, dismissed. Are you able to see, click answer?
I am. Okay, so I see the open questions. Which
It's
one is
in
that?
answered now because I just asked it, so I moved it over.
I see. Okay. Aha. Okay. Um, so I know the author of the question, and it's nice to see who's answering this question. So first part of the answer is to say, yeah, in a sense, I am taking out a middle ground analysis between structure and agency. I do think that it is possible, this is the theme of the talk, to have an unjust society in which people are still held responsible for their agency and their choices if they choose to act in a culpable way. So now the idea, regardless of whether we exist in a dystopia or a utopia, it depends, right? So I premise this by saying that we're not a extremely unjust society. It's not a dystopia. So there are limits, but I think insofar as the society as a whole is close enough to just that it can claim to be enforcing laws that generally are just, then yes, punishment for acts that are particularly mala in se, murder, rape, assault, etc., should be done. Now, the analogy, I'm stopped for driving 70 in a 50-mile-per-hour zone, but you're keeping up with traffic. So if you're keeping up with traffic, then your act is justified. So that sort of negates the question in a way. So let's change it. Let's say you're keeping up, you're doing 80 in a 50-mile-an-hour zone, and most people are doing 60. So you are weaving, you're passing, you're driving a bit dangerously. That's somewhere between a mala in se crime, because it's inherently wrong to drive dangerously, and a mala prohibitum crime, because it's also prohibited, and the details of the prohibitions affect the nature of the crime. Put that aside. Add to the fact that, let's suppose that 10% of drivers on the highway are driving as fast as you are. So it's not that you're driving in a way that is actually safe. That's the way the question is framed. You're driving in an unsafe way, but you're not unique. And let's suppose that you get picked out for punishment because you're black. You're driving while black. Then there's a serious problem in the selection of enforcement. And that's a tricky topic. On the one hand, I think that the right thing to do is to say we should punish you and everyone else who does that sort of thing. But perhaps as a way of dissuading the police from engaging in racist targeting of speeders, we should block the prosecution in a few cases to convey the message that the police may not do this sort of thing. It's like why we suppress evidence if there's a Fourth Amendment violation. We do it not so much as the only way of protecting people against having their right to privacy infringed. We do it because it sends a message to the police: you can't do this and get your ends met. I hope that was an answer to that rather complex and interesting question.
Okay, next one.
Yeah.
You put the crime of theft along with murder and rape on the side of those offenses that even disadvantaged persons are obliged not to commit. But is theft really like murder and rape? After all, the disadvantages that you pointed mostly involve economic inequality. If a person steals because he has been in some sense the victim of an unjust economic system, should he nevertheless be held liable for the act?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is it depends. There's theft and there's theft, right? So, if you are a fan of Les Miserables, as I am, then you've thought about Jean Valjean and he was captured and punished for stealing a loaf of bread necessary to survive. So, theft from the poor who are so poor that they can't actually hope to lead a decent life. Theft that is meant to address that, I think that's arguably excusable. And insofar as it's justified, excusable is the wrong word, arguably justifiable. Insofar as it's justified, it should not be prosecuted. Obviously one should do something when one catches a thief in such a circumstance, but presumably the thing to do is more like what was done in Les Miserables. Try to help the thief so that he or she no longer needs to do that. But now, take other kinds of cases where you have someone who grows up in an environment where, let's say, hot wiring, or no, not hot wiring, stealing cars. I'm trying to remember the name of what this kind of thing was called. Basically, you're carjacked, right? You're taken out of your car and someone rides off with your car, or someone just takes your car and joyrides with it and crashes it. Often this kind of crime actually makes the situation worse for other poor people because it's committed in the community in which the poor people live. That kind of crime should not be excused. It's a wrong, and as a wrong, it should be made clear that this kind of thing will not be tolerated. So, yeah, it depends.
Okay, we're going to try to do two more.
Okay.
Let's see. Let's take the example of an African-American man returning from prison to an under-resourced neighborhood. He is unable to find a job due to the combination of racism among prospective employers, barriers based on his criminal record, and the lack of resources in his neighborhood and social network. So he sells drugs in order to meet his basic needs. This has clear social harms, while it is also clearly brought about by structural criminogenic factors. How would you describe blame in this situation, and what kind of rehabilitation would you argue is appropriate?
Okay. So again, the question is whether this kind of activity is justified in the context. And again, I'm inclined to say that it might well be justified in the context, right? Even though there are harms from selling drugs, and it may depend on the kind of drug, and it may depend on to whom he's selling. So again, details matter. So let's suppose you've got someone who's selling marijuana to adults. Contrast that with someone who's selling cocaine or something even more dangerous, meth to children, right? So, if the person is engaged in an activity that, in the context, all things considered, should actually be permissible, then no punishment should be brought down on the person. If the person is engaging in activity that itself or in the way in which it's done, again, selling to children, should not be permissible, then I think punishment is called for. The point is this. While we struggle with the problems of structural racism and economic inequality, we can't just abandon people who live in the poor and ghettoized neighborhoods to predatory, violent, unjust behavior in their midst. They need the benefits of policing, and people in those neighborhoods need to be made aware that things that are unjustifiable, and there are still many such things, cannot be tolerated. At the same time, as a society, we need to be working on those problems. And as prosecutors and jurors, we need to be attuned to the fine details to determine whether or not this is not the kind of case for which a prosecution is appropriate or for which a conviction is appropriate.
Okay, this will be the last one.
Okay.
Someone asked, at this stage, would you agree that we should rename the Department of Justice and recall it and call it Department of Law? Because rarely justice is the goal of some judges, prosecutors, or an attorney general. We are at the mercy of some majority lawmakers who are driven by motives other than justice and equality.
Oh, very nice, very nice. I'm sympathetic with the tone of the question. However, I think it's important that it's important that we maintain the aspiration to justice. And I think I'll stick by that thought. On the one hand, you can say that, there's a sort of Orwellian problem here. Insofar as we call something what it is not, we corrupt the language. And when we corrupt the language, that actually leads to more abuse. So I'm sensitive to that thought. At the same time, I think the flip side of the coin is we want it to be a Department of Justice, right? We want prosecutors to take seriously the commitment to pursuing justice. And if we call it the Department of Law and we try to separate law from justice, I think we do a disservice to the long-term prospects that we could have a better Department of Justice. So no, I would keep the name.
I think we can do, this one was more of a statement, but there may be
Sure.
room for you to give a thought. Someone had said, since our nation is rather young compared to many other civilized nations, is it naive to believe that the systems originally put in place when our nation was founded will be so easily adjusted or replaced? Maybe what is needed is more individual families teaching our kids to treat others as you treated more profoundly, and in time that may change our culture. So I guess the beginning part would be, is it naive to think that we can sort of change the systems put in place when we're not really that old compared to other places?
Yeah. So let me say two things about that. I always seem to have a one hand and the other hand. So on the one hand, we're actually very old. I think we have the oldest constitution of any constitutionally governed country in the world, right? And our old constitution turns out to be very hard to amend. And so in some sense, we're kind of stuck. I mean, think about the Electoral College. I heard someone on NPR the other day claiming that the Electoral College was something that he valued very much because it kept him enfranchised. This is some white guy from Wisconsin. And I wonder what kind of indoctrination he's received, because what the Electoral College does is clearly disenfranchises huge percentage of the country in terms of voting for the president. We here in New Jersey have very little reason to go out and vote because our votes basically won't matter. We know we're a blue state, and so the candidates don't campaign here. They don't seek our votes. They trust we're going to go blue. 12 of 13 states are all that matter. The Electoral College gets in the way. And, we can understand what the naive thoughts of the founders were that led to the Electoral College, but it should be got rid of. And yet we can't. The Supreme Court is becoming more and more politicized, and there are all sorts of good ideas out there for how to fix it. And they're very hard to address because we're actually a really tightly constrained by our Constitution and all that has happened kind of country. So we're not a young country in that sense. On the other hand, what was the other hand for that one? Well, I guess on the other hand, maybe culturally, we are still a young country. And I think we are in some sense coming now to terms with the way in which we can't just open up new land and send people there. The old American dream that was handled by expansion west, well, that's not really available anymore. So we're going to have to grow up in a certain way. And in that sense, we are younger than the countries in Europe and Asia and many parts of the world where that dream wasn't there. And now facing that, we may make some interesting transitions. So I think these are scary times. But I also think that they're hopeful times. And, I hope that between various other levels of society that do care about justice, we can make progress. I think I'll end with that optimistic thought.
That's great. Thank you. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time to give this presentation. I really appreciate you. Everyone who's still on the call, we're going to send a survey around, a post-event survey. It will also have a link. This event was recorded, so we'll give you a link to where the recording is posted. And then we ask for some feedback as we continue to plan moving forward. Our next speaker is an alum, Kelly DiDio, and she is an associate dean and professor of art history at UVM, and she's going to present Monuments That Erase History, Public Sculptures and the Calls to Remove Them. So that will be next Tuesday, I believe. The invitation should be going out, and everything is always on the SAS events website as well. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Professor Walen.
Thank you.
I think that's it for today.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.